Dear friends, in this video we will talk about how human beings are going to return to the moon in the coming years. The Artemis program is spearheaded almost entirely by NASA, with their few partner space agencies and private companies helping out along the way. The leader among them all is SpaceX, who are tasked with delivering the Lunar Starship vehicle that will actually allow astronauts to touch down on the moon's surface for the first time. In over 50 years, as with all things in the space flight industry, the Artemis program has been in a constant state of flux. Timelines and flight plans are being revised and rewritten as different variables come into play. It can be a bit difficult to keep track of, so today we are focusing in on how SpaceX and NASA are going to return a human presence to the moon. Even though SpaceX is essentially just functioning as a NASA subcontractor in the mission of the Artemis program, they are also responsible for delivering the biggest, most powerful, and arguably most important part of the entire moon landing mission. The Lunar Starship human landing system is a giant missing piece in the NASA mission. They have the SLS launcher to provide the lunar orbit, and they have the Orion spacecraft that can support the crew off on a trip around the moon and bring them back home again safely. But they don't have any vehicle in their lineup that can ferry the crew down from Orion to the surface and send them back up again, so they outsourced that job to the private sector back in the olden days of the Apollo program. NASA was able to fit a small lunar lander into the same rocket that launched their command module. The landing craft was stashed away in the cargo fairing of the Saturn V, just below the service module. Once the upper stage of the rocket was coasting in orbit, the service module and capsule were separate together and flew out a short distance, then came around and returned to dock the nose of the command module into the lunar module. Then once they were connected to the service module, thrusters would extract the lander from the upper stage of the rocket, and they would all fly to the moon together as one unit. Also, this was the 1960s, so that the whole maneuver had to be performed manually by a pilot. No automation available logistically. That the whole system just doesn't work for the modern Artemis program. For one, the SLS doesn't offer the same lift capability as the old Saturn V. The Apollo-era rocket could deliver 43 metric tons to the moon, while SLS maxes out at 27 tons, which is enough to send the Orion capsule and service module, but not much more, so SLS has more thrust at liftoff than Saturn V. But if there was more power available, NASA doesn't want to just get by anymore with a flimsy little stowaway moon lander. The whole point of Artemis is to establish a strong and permanent human presence on the moon. To do that, we need the landing vehicle, possible one that can deliver heavy infrastructure while also supporting a crew for their week-long excursions to the lunar surface. This is where the Artemis program becomes a tale of two gigantic rockets. SpaceX was awarded the first human landing system contract by NASA because their vehicle was by far the biggest and the most powerful. It may not have been the most practical, but at the same time, SpaceX had already been making good progress on launch hardware like the Raptor engine and had a very solid track record of success with Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, so NASA took Elon Musk at his word that his people would get it figured out by 2025, and they've been doing a pretty good job at that so far. Starship flew for the first time in April 2023, and then it exploded, which was not ideal, but that's not the end of the world. The Lunar Starship that is going to fly to the moon will be pretty similar to the designs that we have seen so far being tested at Boca Chica, but with a few key differences. The most significant being that the Lunar Starship will never re-enter Earth's atmosphere, so it won't require the black heat shield and tail of the upper stage. Those won't serve any function on the moon after shedding that excess weight. Starship will need a bunch of upgrades to function as a lunar lander, chief among those being a new set of landing legs. There won't be any chop-arm towers waiting on the moon. These spindly legs that we saw on the earlier Starship prototypes won't do either. The Lunar Starship needs a wide, stable footprint to land on something more similar to a Falcon 9 booster, and the ship will also require landing thrusters as well. We've seen these in a few renderings mounted on the side of the vehicle. SpaceX will also need to devise an elevator system for their Lunar Starship, since the lower two-thirds of the 50-meter-tall ship are taken up by fuel tanks. The crew is going to need some help to travel the 30-odd meters that separate them from the ground. This is also going to be critical for deploying payloads to the lunar surface. Luckily, the gravity on the moon is 1/6 of the Earth, so the lift doesn't have to be particularly strong, just reliable. Above the cargo hold will need to be a crew quarters. That should be no problem considering the gigantic 9-meter wide space left at the top of the ship for just 2 people. It's going to be plenty spacious for a week-long stay on the moon. All that SpaceX needs to do is furnish and pressurize a few levels within the upper fairing. They have a well-proven life support system from the Crew Dragon capsule that just needs to be scaled up a bit for the relatively short-duration moon landings. Figuring out a Mars life support system for Starship is going to be the hard part. And then lastly, they just need a small docking port up in the tip of the nose cone, something that SpaceX can also just lift from the Dragon capsule. This is how the Orion crew will link up with the Starship and transfer between vehicles, so there is a lot of work for SpaceX to accomplish over the next 2 years, but there is still one more significant hurdle to overcome. But there is one major problem here. On its own, using only the fuel that it launches with, Starship cannot go beyond low Earth orbit. By the time a Starship gets just a couple hundred miles above the Earth's surface, it runs out of gas. So in order to go any higher, like say to the moon, Starship needs to refuel. Specifically, it needs a lot more liquid oxygen and a bit more liquid methane. So before Lunar Starship even becomes possibility, SpaceX needs to first perfect the tanker Starship. The tanker variant is going to be a stripped-down upper stage vehicle, knowing no heat shield, no legs, no cargo fairing, just fuel tanks from top to bottom. But even with the extra large tanks, the ship will need to burn most of its fuel just to reach orbit. That means that a reusable filler ship will have to go up and dock with the tanker to add more oxygen and methane to the reservoir. But again, even carrying nothing but fuel, the ship still has to burn most of it just to reach orbit, so it's going to require multiple docking maneuvers just to fill one tanker ship with enough propellant to then refill the Lunar Starship with enough to get it to the moon. That's going to get expensive fast unless SpaceX can master the fully reusable upper stage ship. Elon Musk has said it can be as little as 4 tanker ships. Others have claimed as many as 16 launches will be required to fill one Lunar Starship, and before the Lunar Starship can be verified for human space flight, SpaceX will need to perform one uncrewed demonstrate creation landing on the moon before Artemis 3. This puts a lot of pressure on SpaceX to deliver not just one functional Starship that can make it into orbit and come back down again in one piece, but they have to make a lot of them. But they don't have a whole lot of time left to do it. Meanwhile, over at NASA, they have already flown one uncrewed Artemis mission with the SLS and Orion to verify the flight hardware, and thanks to the overwhelming success in 2022, NASA is clear for the first crew Artemis launch in 2024 that will feature a round trip with 4 astronauts in the Orion spacecraft. They'll circle the moon and then return home for a splashdown to fuel the content. NASA already has flight hardware ready to go for Artemis 2 and Artemis 3. The core fuel tanks are already under construction, while the main engines and side boosters are mostly just old space shuttle leftovers that are already good to go. So while it is really fun and exciting to watch Starship test flights and explosions, this is today's video. Thanks for watching. Also subscribe to the channel.